I wish to put on record my opposition to the gender quota proposals in this legislation. And the reason I oppose the provisions is, first of all, I believe that they are very likely to be unconstitutional. They certainly seem to me to be against many provisions in the Constitution. Secondly, I think they're undemocratic. And thirdly, I think they're discriminatory. And those are my grounds for objecting to them. But first of all, I just wanted to talk about, I think that the move towards bringing in legislative quotas in Ireland, I think, is very much based on information which is basically misleading, and people have been misinformed about, for example, the examples that have been given by Deputy O'Sullivan and Deputy McClellan about the situation in Sweden. Now, first of all, I would mention that most countries in the EU don't have legislated for quotas, nor do they have constitutional quotas. The majority of countries in Europe, some parties within those countries have voluntary quotas, but even in those countries themselves, it's not necessarily the norm or the majority of parties that have the voluntary quotas. And what I would say as well is that our proposed legislation, in fact, it hasn't been implemented in most countries, and in fact, in countries where it has been quite unsuccessful. Now, just in relation to the claims regarding Sweden, I've read a bit into this, and the situation, in fact, is that it's often cited as the example for quotas working, but in fact, there have never been legislated for quotas in Sweden. And I'm just reading here. I'm just going to quote from a paper by Lenisha Friedenwald. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, but she is an academic in Sweden. She's based in the University of Stockholm, and she's a member of the Women in Politics Research Centre, and she also carries out research on behalf of the Quota Project. So she's very much, she's obviously favourable to quotas herself, but this is what she says about the Scandinavian countries and Sweden. She says, in international literature on women in politics, one finds the argument that women's political representation reached a historical and worldwide high in Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway and Sweden, due to quotas. This, however, is not quite accurate. For instance, there have never been any constitutional quota requirements in the Scandinavian countries. Moreover, while almost all parties in Norway have quota provisions, no parties in Denmark use them. Furthermore, only some political parties in Sweden have introduced quotas for public election. And she then goes on to, just to summarise, she says that the Centre Party has enjoyed the best record in terms of the representation of women in Sweden, and they have never operated quotas, and nor do they even have targets in relation to women in politics. And she mentions as well in her paper that the real breakthrough for Scandinavian women occurred in the 1970s before the introduction of any quotas. And she points out that in Sweden, it was largely in the 1970s when the breakthrough was. Again, it was before quotas were introduced, but it has been a slow process. It's been an incremental track, she points out. And she also points out that only 3 out of 7 parties in Sweden have ever operated gender quotas. So, I think that's important information that hasn't been put out there. The other misleading point that's made is that the parties are somehow the obstacle to women getting involved in politics and running for election. But in fact, that's not borne out by the statistics that are out there that anyone can go and research for themselves, as I did. For example, in the 2011 general election, the percent of independent candidates that were women was 8.95%, or 18 out of 201 candidates. The percent of women candidates that ran for registered political parties was in fact 18.3%, which was double the percentage of independent candidates that were women. And when you go into the parties themselves, you find that many parties ran quite a high percentage of women. For example, Labour ran 26.4%, Sinn Féin almost 20%, the People Before Profit ran 44.4%. The party in the Dáil with the highest percentage of women is actually the Socialist Party. It has exactly 50% women and 50% men, and they ran, of the parties, one of the lowest percentage of women. They ran 11.1% of women candidates, or 1 out of 9 of their candidates were women. So, that's the fact. The parties are positively encouraging women to run, and, there are obviously other reasons why women are not putting themselves forward for election. And as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence out there. I have never been presented with evidence that women are any less likely to be selected at a selection convention if they push forward their name to that convention than a man. Men lose selection conventions, women lose them. men win them and women win them. And in fact, you know, generally women who put forward their names forward for selection conventions and political parties are very successful. That is actually the factual situation. So that's my first point. Now, just to go into the undemocratic nature of quotas. And I just would mention as well, France has the type of legislation we have. After 12 years of having the kind of legislation we are proposing here, it is only 19% of women in its national parliament, which is exactly what the worldwide percentage for women's participation in politics is, and not much greater than what we have here in the Dáil. Quotas are, as I've said many times, they're not democratic. They don't leave it to the voters at selection conventions to make up their own mind to who to vote for. They try and engineer the outcome. They're imposed from the top as opposed from the grassroots. And the thing about quotas is they will be put in the hands of leaders to implement, and they will impose them. And you know, the point as well is that quotas do not suit our electoral system because we have constituencies, because we have individual people named on ballot papers. We don't have a list system where you can start winning 50 men and 50 women and things like that. So very often a party might pick one or two candidates in a constituency. And for example, if you look at, you know, if a party leader decides to impose it in a constituency, and the decision is in that particular constituency to have one woman and one man candidate, well, that means in practice that a woman who would get more votes than the highest placed man in terms of the contest would not be selected because the man had to take the place on the ballot paper, even though she would have more votes. You know, when she was, if she was the second placed woman in that contest, but below her was the highest placed man, she would not be selected, even though she had more votes than the man. And that, you know, the situation with that kind of discrimination is it often backfires and defeats the purpose. And for example, in Sweden, courts have recently ruled against quotas in Swedish universities because they have discriminated against women who've had better results than the men but are losing places in university courses because of quotas that were in place. And the other point I would say, and many people would agree with me on this, if you want more women in politics and you want more women from running for election, what you need is women to get active in politics at grassroots level and to have a real say. And what quotas do is they do the opposite to that. They undermine the participation by men and women in political parties. They undermine the democracy in political parties, and they give too much control and power to party leaders. Now, the other thing is, as I've mentioned there, the quotas are discriminatory. They're a blunt instrument. Many people have said that, including people who are in favour of them. But they're an even blunter system, instrument in our electoral system, where a party, you know, you can't just say, right, there'll be a quota. You'll have to pick and choose constituencies where they are implemented. And you can be pretty sure party leaders will not impose them against the men or women they want to see on the ticket. You know, so they're a blunt instrument that can be abused. And I would make the point as well that what this legislation does is it enshrines discrimination into our law. There's no discrimination in law now at the present in relation to a person's gender when they are put on, you know, when they want to run for election. And in fact, in Article 16.3, it says you can't, you know, someone can't be made disabled from basically being a member of the Dáil on the basis of their gender. But what we're doing is we're actually making the issue of gender a factor in whether someone gets to actually run for election from a political party. The other thing is, what it does is it makes the issue about what your gender is, as opposed to people running as human beings and in solidarity as men and women. People are distinguished by their gender. Now, I want very quickly to raise the unconstitutional aspect. Very quickly, the committee here that looked at PRS-TV a couple of years ago, the Joint Committee on the Constitution, basically decided that, well, what it said was, the committee was advised that measures which went further than merely encouraging political parties to take positive measures with regard to female candidates would raise serious constitutional questions. But what they basically said was they felt that any measure which coerced political parties to select certain types of candidates or which imposed a quota in that regard would be unconstitutional. And they also mentioned the Kelly case, Kelly versus the Minister for Environment, where the judgment was made on the basis of you can't treat candidates unequally in elections. But with this legislation, state funding will be used to discriminate between candidates on the basis of their gender. So I believe that's in conflict with with the Kelly case. Other people have raised concerns about it. It obviously affects the freedom of association and imposes on political parties using the state mechanism of funding what they should do in elections. And I believe this will be found unconstitutional.